this panel is framed very much in terms of regional integration and geopolitics, but I would like in this presentation to take you back to the pre-geopolitics of Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict and a time when the conflict was resolutely local. I'm actually going to be presenting a more limited topic than the one that's advertised. This is one part of a bigger piece that examines the causes of conflict and violence in the period between 1988 and 1994. I will actually be focusing in this presentation on the role of affective dispositions and emotions in the communal violence between 1988 and 1990. And the reason I want to focus on this is that as I was working on the bigger piece, it struck me how most explanations of the violence in this period come from comparative studies of post-Soviet secessionism. And these comparative studies have generated explanations that work more or less imperfectly across the conflicts in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Chechnya, Transnistria, and Karabakh. And they emphasize numerous factors that comprise a kind of generalized script of post-Soviet secessionist violence, such as the decline of the Central Soviet state, its fracturing across an ethno-federal institutional structure, the ceding of political and coercive monopolies to nationalists and private armies, and identity narratives that legitimated the new ethno-territorial orders manifested in today's so-called de facto states. Now, this script certainly applies to the Armenian-Azerbaijani context from around 1990, but it raises three problems, and these are the questions that I want to address in this paper. The first is that many of the elements of this wider script, such as the demonstration effects of violence elsewhere in the state, Moscow's ambivalence and inability to intervene decisively, are simply not present in early 1988. The clash near Agdam on the 22nd of February and the pogrom in Sumgait a few days later are right at the beginning of the curve of nationalist mobilization that brought the Soviet Union down. And so we have this problem of the early riser status of communal violence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. What explains this outcome of communal violence in advance of the emergence of mass movements, nationalist leaderships, and central state decline? The second question is that much of the communal violence, and certainly its largest single explosions, took place far from the disputed border in Nagorno Karabakh. They were taking place in disparate and contextually quite varied locations across the Armenian-Azerbaijani space. So unless you believe that this outcome is the result of a massive domino effect and that local circumstances and motivations don't matter, this is a rather curious factor and needs explanation. The third question is what made people attack ethnic others in the absence of threat? Victims were generally unarmed civilian populations, neighbors, colleagues, acquaintances, amongst two increasingly marginalized minorities. These were not, on the whole, populations that could be seen as posing a threat or a clear and present danger, and so fear seems a suspect explanation for the violence that was enacted against them. So why the focus on emotions? As a framework for explaining collective violence, an emotion-centered perspective remains an outlier, which is curious given the obvious quality of emotions and their role in membership of any kind of imagined community. In fact, an emotional narrative lies at the heart, even if this is only implicitly so, of many of our most popular theories of nationalism. The well-known theories of Ernest Gellner, Rogers Brubaker, and Anthony Smith all have an emotional narrative at their core, and even the more elite constructivist theories, such as those of Miroslav Hroch or Paul Brass, are predicated on elite capacities to harness popular emotions. And where I think emotions are particularly useful is on gaining a handle on the micro motivations of violence, what makes individuals participate. Now, I want to make clear that I am not arguing that emotions explain everything, nor am I suggesting that everyone in a particular context was gripped by these emotions. That would be an irresponsible extrapolation, and I'm certainly not attributing violence to the passions of exotic peoples. Some scholars have usefully focused attention on the role of emotions. The most developed single account, and this is the theoretical framework that I make use of, is that of Roger Peterson. I draw on his quartet of emotional narratives: fear, hatred, rage, and resentment. So fear predicts violence enacted against the group that presents a threat. Hatred predicts violence against a group which represents historically framed grievances, and resentment predicts violence towards groups that are challenging a status hierarchy. In the Armenian-Azerbaijani case, Ronald Grigosuni, Stuart Kaufman, and Thomas de Waal have all in different ways pointed to the role of hatred as a driver of violence. And while I think this is useful, their emphasis is perhaps too singular in terms of the range of possible emotions, and also too symmetrical. So in the paper, I make three core arguments. The first is that there are, in fact, two scripts of Armenian-Azerbaijani violence. The second script, script B, is the script of organized secessionist violence, escalating at the conjuncture of systemic decline, the institutionalization of nationalist parties and programs, and the rise of private armies, and this is clearly in force by 1990. But script A, which is chronologically and causally anterior, is the script of Armenian-Azerbaijani communal violence enacted by civilians against civilians and driven by affective dispositions shaped by local constellations of group interaction. Second, I suggest that the affective dispositions driving communal violence were different across the conflict. In the case of anti-Armenian violence in Azerbaijan, I argue that resentment provides the most plausible, dominant emotional narrative. And to show where this resentment came from, I examine the specific context of early Soviet Azerbaijan, which retained several recognizably colonial features, namely a substantial influx of Russian settlers and skills and an intrusive language policy. But I also show that this Russian stewardship of Azerbaijani modernization, if you will, was always shared with Armenians. Armenians played visible roles in the technical elite, showed robust demographic growth through to the 1960s, and most tellingly remained substantially overrepresented in Azerbaijani Communist Party membership through to the 1970s. So I argue that this context was increasingly challenged over time by a pattern that I call delayed indigenization, as Azerbaijanis caught up and indigenized the republic. But much of Azerbaijan's urban space remained predominantly Russian-speaking, and so, to a nationalist perspective, ethnically foreign. Obviously, I'm summarizing a much more complex argument, but I suggest that accrued resentments from this pattern of delayed indigenization, combined with several precipitating events in late 1987 and early 1988, including the dismissal of Heydar Aliyev from the Politburo, rumors of anti-Azerbaijani violence in Armenia, and the local Soviets' resolution in Nagorno Karabakh for unification with Armenia, produced an emotional disposition of resentment towards the Armenians as a group that were trying to reverse a fragile ethnic hierarchy in the autonomous oblast. I want to particularly signal that I think that this is a more useful explanation than the very widely cited narrative that we have, which is that communal violence in Azerbaijan was basically a process of revenge attacks enacted by refugees. Lots of problems with that view, which we can perhaps discuss in the Q&A. In the case of anti-Azerbaijani violence in Armenia, I argue that a very different emotional disposition was at play, and I argue that hatred, understood as a deep cultural schema prescribing innate, historically framed roles to different groups, provides a better explanation. That cultural schema was genocide. I look at the work of cultural anthropologists, notably Harutyan Marutyan, and how they show that the massacre of Armenians in Sumgait instantly cued this cultural schema of genocide. The pogrom in Sumgait and all subsequent outbreaks of anti-Armenian violence in Azerbaijan, and even local incidents in Armenia, such as outbreaks of disease, were merged into a unified narrative of serial genocide. While Stalinist state violence was also included in this list, a key effect was to collapse the variegated terrains of Armenian-Azerbaijani coexistence into a transcendent cultural schema of Armenian victimization at the hands of undifferentiated Turks. And this legitimated the use of violence against Azerbaijanis, resulting in their ultimate mass expulsion. In my recent discussions over the last few years in Armenia about these events, there is a parallel that is often drawn with the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923. So this is framed as a regrettable but perhaps inevitable or even commonsensical outcome. With regard to violence in the autonomous oblast itself, I argue that these effective dispositions from outside of the region were also at play, but fear does provide an effective reading of the emotional dispositions in the province. Armenian fears regarding their future in the oblast are well documented. I might summarize them by referring to the ambiguity of autonomy in Nagorno Karabakh, which made little or no reference to a titular nationality. It was a geographic concept that lacked a clear ethnic hierarchy, and that drove a consistent concern with demography. That was a core fear, demographic fear for Armenians in the province. I also showed that the Azerbaijani minority in Nagorno-Karabakh also had reasons to experience insecurity. Azerbaijani settlements were not spatially patterned to form a unifying ethno-space with Azerbaijani settled areas outside of the province, and so we have a strategic context of double encirclement. So to sum up, rather than singular or symmetrical emotional motivations, I argue that place and specifically local group configurations matter for understanding the communal violence that engulfed these societies in this period. My final core argument regards the elusive role of leadership in the early stages of Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. Unless you are a conspiracy theorist, one of the striking things about this conflict between 1988 and the 1990s is the very long succession of dismissed or toppled leadership figures, which indicates that they were not necessarily in control of events. And this matters because it challenges popular theories of ethnic violence that emphasize elite manipulations. So Chip Gagnon, for instance, makes this argument in his book, The Myth of Ethnic War, writing about Serbia and Croatia in the 1990s. We don't have a Slobodan Milosevic or a Franjo Tudjman to explain and symbolize the instrumentality of Armenian-Azerbaijani violence in its early phases, and I think it can be argued that an emotion-centered approach provides the missing causality. Emotion can substitute for leadership when there is a collective understanding of the justness of a particular target. So although Armenian and Azerbaijani grievances against Russians could be and were articulated, and Russians were present on the ground, if in smaller numbers, they were not attacked. So violence in 1988 in these two republics was not random, but directed by a common understanding amongst perpetrators and approving bystanders as to who the appropriate target was, and I argue that this understanding was provided by emotion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Broers.